Hello everyone, it's great to see you again here as we come to read the Big Picture Story Bible again. Do you remember what we've seen so far? We've seen God made big promises to Abraham. He said to Abraham, you would have a big nation would come from you. And then Isaac was born, and then Jacob was born to Isaac, and then Jacob had 12 sons. Remember we saw last time that they didn't like their brother's Joseph, and so they sold him as a slave. But God was still looking out for his people, wasn't he? And he provided for them. Well, today as we come to part 6, we read about God's people becoming great. Jacob moved his growing household to Egypt. Bags were packed, camels and donkeys were loaded with things, and everyone started out. First came Jacob, the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham. Next there came Jacob's sons, and then came all their families. 70 people moved to Egypt. By now, God's promise of a great people was really growing. And God's promise kept growing long after Jacob and his sons died. After 400 years in Egypt, God's people had grown into a great nation named Israel. In fact, Israel had so many people that the land was filled with them. Do you think the Egyptians liked having these people in their land? Well, Pharaoh, the king of the land, hated the people of Israel. Pharaoh hated Israel's God too. And so he treated God's people like slaves, and he made them work and work and work. He was so evil that he even killed some of God's people. God's people were in trouble. They cried out to God for help, and God heard them. Do you see that little baby boy? See him over here? Well, he was God's answer to the people's cry for help. His name was Moses, and one day he would rescue God's people. When Moses grew up, God spoke to him. Moses listened to God, and then Moses did what God told him to do. He went to the Pharaoh and said God's words, "Let my people go." But the king said no. He did not listen to God. Moses told Pharaoh that if he disobeyed God's word, terrible things would happen to the Egyptians. Did that make the king decide to listen to God? No. Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made the river turn to blood. See this, the River Nile. The entire land swarmed with frogs. I see this person's got frogs in her bed. And dust turned into gnats. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made the houses full of flies. The animals of the Egyptians got sick and died. And the people got painful sores. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made hail fall from the sky. Locusts covered the ground, and darkness spread out over the land. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. I wonder, can you imagine what it would take for Pharaoh to let God's people go? Well, that's what we'll find out in the next part. But maybe you want to draw a picture. Maybe you could draw a picture of some of the signs that God sent to Pharaoh. Maybe the hail or the locusts or the darkness, or maybe you could draw the frogs or the dust turning into gnats, or maybe you could do all the flies. And we'll come back to that next time. Well, goodbye, and I'll hopefully see you next week.